So for this week's show, I thought it would be fun to give you guys a behind-the-scenes look at our weekly production meeting. So let's head into the office. Oh, Steve left one of his toys in the hallway. I have to talk to him about that. What's Fancy doing here, and why is he untied? Oh, I'm sure this is just an absolutely fascinating story. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, the show where we have fun discussing horror movies. I am your host, Steve the Cat. And once again, thank you so much to our social media fact-checker friends for pointing out that this is not, in fact, Steve the Cat. This is Steve's animatronic stunt double, being joined today by Fancy the animatronic.
Say it.
No, I'm not going to say it.
Say it.
Fine. Joining Steve's animatronic stunt double is Mr. Fancy, the animatronic production assistant.
Now fetch my hot chocolate.
Okay, here you go.
And the bendy straw.
Okay, here you go. All right, so you're probably wondering what the story is behind all of this. So, real quickly, Mr. Fancy may or may not be demonically possessed. If you've been watching the show, you're aware of that. Now, it was inevitable that eventually the maybe or maybe not demonically possessed Mr. Fancy would eventually challenge Steve the Cat to a fiddle contest for the prize of his soul. So, Steve took him up on the challenge. They quickly realized that A, nobody in the household actually owns a fiddle, and B, neither one of them has opposable thumbs or fingers, so the fiddle contest was a draw. So then they went into a rock, paper, scissors contest, but again, after several hours of both of them only throwing paper, they finally realized that the lack of fingers and thumbs was going to make that not the way to go. So finally they settled on a staring contest. Steve the Cat thought he had an advantage because cats don't have to blink. But on the other hand, Mr. Fancy, being a plastic plush toy, doesn't have eyelids and couldn't blink if he wanted to. So after about 3 hours, Steve the Cat fell asleep and forfeited the staring contest. Fortunately for Steve the Cat, Fancy is more interested in having a title than having a cat's soul. So Mr. Fancy is now a production assistant here on Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, meaning I have been demoted to camera operator.
Say it.
Fine. My new title is Camera Monkey. Anyway, we've got a good show today. We're going to talk about a couple of woodland creature features, so stand by. Here we go with Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. Before we get into this week's movies, we once again need to do Steve's vocabulary lesson. This is the part of the show where we investigate creative ways to use the English language in order to stay ahead of social media bots and algorithms that would try to ban us. Word number 1 for this week. Brunching. This is a noun, referring to the action when one character in a movie munches or snacks upon another character in the movie in a celebratory or festive manner. It's very important to keep in mind that the celebratory or festive manner is part of this definition. It's not enough just to munch or snack on another character. Word number 2, Christmas treeing. Again, similar to brunching, this is a noun referring to the action when one character in a film hangs another character from a tree in a decorative or festive manner. Again, the intention here is important. It can't just be hanging a guy from a tree. Clint Eastwood strings up a bad guy in a Western, not Christmas treeing. Predator strings up the body of Jesse the Body Ventura in a celebratory manner, That's Christmas treeing. If the Predator movies taught us anything, it's that the Predators are a very festive people. Please keep these words in mind. They will appear later in the episode. So we're doing another creature feature double feature this week. So let's get into this week's featured creatures. Well, it's a little different this time around. We're doing some mythical woodland monsters, but we've already done Sasquatch, so we're doing a couple of other things that you might find in the woods that aren't Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So the first thing we're going to talk about is called a Jotun, and I may be mispronouncing that. Cut me some slack. I'm a cat, not a Viking. This is a creature from Norse mythology, and it is a type of being that is separate from gods, elves, and dwarves. Now, if you are familiar with, for example, Norse mythology or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you may look at this and think it means giant, and often in scholarly texts the term Jotun is used interchangeably with giant, but that is not always technically correct. Jotun are often portrayed as having gigantic proportions, but not always. Now, in the movie we're going to watch today, the Jotun does have gigantic proportions, but just understand that Jotun are not always giants, not always horrifying and unattractive in Norse mythology. Jotun are descendants of a being called Ymir. Ymir is the proto-being from which the world was created in Norse mythology, and the Jotun are descendants of Ymir. In fact, if I understand my mythology correctly, they were actually created asexually from various pieces of Ymir's body. They typically dwell in the realm of Jotunheim. If you are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the four aspects of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then you're familiar with Jotunheim, the realm of the frost giants, for example. The Jotun are typically portrayed negatively or as villains in Scandinavian folklore, so they're generally not the good guys. Our second creature for today is the Wendigo. And when we talk about the Wendigo, we're now moving from European mythology to Algonquin myth in North America. The Wendigo is believed to be a malevolent spirit that possesses human beings. It is often depicted as having human-like characteristics, arms and legs and such. Very often it is portrayed as having a stag's head, although not always. Now, the thing about the Wendigo is generally its appearance is very emaciated, with its skin stretched very tautly over its bones as if it's constantly starving, and there is a reason for that. It's because the spirit of the Wendigo is associated with insatiable greed and hunger, and often associated with a desire to commit cannibalism. So the Wendigo is kind of a metaphor or an allegory for greed and hunger, and insatiable greed and hunger especially. In some myths, a person becomes a Wendigo after succumbing to the urge to commit cannibalism. In other myths, Wendigo possession actually drives a person to commit cannibalism, but one way or another, cannibalism and the Wendigo are intertwined. In fact, there is a psychological condition, Wendigo, I believe it's called Wendigo syndrome, that does have to do with the desire to commit cannibalism. So it is something that is pretty well established not only in mythology but in scholarly texts as well. So there's not nearly as many movies that talk about Jotun and Wendigo as there are about Bigfoot, for example, but we do have a few examples. So let's talk about a few. Wendigo, obviously. The Ritual, which we will be reviewing today. She Walks the Woods, which we will also be reviewing today. Ravenous. Dark Was the Night. Frostbiter, Wrath of the Wendigo. Bound by Blood. Now, if you're familiar with the anime or manga series Attack on Titan, the Titans in those books or the anime, whichever you prefer, were inspired by the Jotun. So I guess they're not technically Jotun, but they are inspired by Jotun. And Jotun and Wendigo also appear in numerous video games and comics. So we've got to talk about the Gaussian distribution of horror film absurdity if we're going to talk about how to enjoy these movies. So our first movie for today is The Ritual, and you're going to want to go into that with kind of a serious mindset. It is a pretty serious movie. There's not a whole lot of humor in this one. It's not a humorous subject. So Not necessarily a great movie if it's a bunch of people coming over to have some pizza and drinks and have a good time. If you're in the mood for a serious movie, that's the movie you want to watch. Our second movie for tonight, She Walks the Woods, kind of more of a middle-of-the-road kind of movie. So if you're in the mood for something a little less serious, a little more lighthearted, but not an outright comedy, She Walks the Woods is more what you're going to go after. Our first movie for today is The Ritual. You can see the poster right there. This is a creature feature that was released in the year 2017. Now, no doubt there are numerous movies out there named The Ritual. The movie we're talking about today is a 2017 creature feature, so it's fairly recent. This was directed by David Bruckner, and the cast includes Rafe Spall, Arshur Ali, Robert James Collier, and Sam Troughton. And as always, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any names. Give me some slack. I'm a cat. The fact that I speak at all should impress you. One note about this movie, this is a Netflix exclusive. Once it was released theatrically in Britain, Netflix bought the rights to this, so if you're looking for this on streaming, I think the only place you're going to find it is Netflix. Let's talk a little bit about this movie. So, this movie is a mysterious woodland creature feature. The story is set in Norway, although the movie was actually filmed in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. Now, I was thinking about that, and my first thought was, well, it must be cheaper to shoot a movie in Romania than it is in Norway, and that is probably true. However, if you're shooting a movie in Norway, you also have to contend with the fact that they are so far north that in the wintertime, there's basically no daylight, and in the summertime, there's very little dark. And just as a practical matter, that's going to make shooting a movie kind of difficult. So even though the movie takes place in Norway, it was filmed in Romania. The gist of the movie is that four friends go on a hike in the Norwegian wilderness in honor of a fallen friend. At the opening of the movie, five male friends are hanging out at the bar, planning what they're going to do with their summer vacation. And that evening, one of the friends is killed tragically in an accident. And that friend had voted that they should go to Norway and go hiking. So the four friends, in honor of their fallen friend, decide to go on that hiking trip to Norway. And the movie title, The Ritual, in part comes from that fact, and the fact that on that trip they set up a shrine to their friend and pour one out for him. As they are heading to the resort where they're going to stay after their hike, one member of the party slips and twists his knee and is having difficulty walking, and so they decide to take a shortcut through a mysterious forest to try to cut some time off the journey. And in a rare display of sanity by a character in a horror movie, one character points out quite sensibly that if a shortcut were actually a shortcut, they would not call it a shortcut, they would call it a route. I mean, he's British, so he says route, but you get the drift. Unfortunately, the friends don't listen to him. They attempt to take a shortcut through the forest. Once they take the shortcut through the forest, they become haunted by nightmares and eventually stalked by a terrifying monster. Now, this movie is good. It is not great, but it's good. On the negative side, the story is kind of generic. On the positive side, it has excellent production values. And also it has a very spooky atmosphere to elevate what would otherwise be a conventional movie. The atmosphere of this movie, even though it's a monster movie, has a lot of almost elements that you would expect to find in a ghost or haunting kind of movie. Just some spooky atmosphere. So let's talk about the villain for this movie. The villain is a Jotun, which we talked a little bit about earlier. You see a picture of it there, at least the silhouette. This belongs to the class of mythical Norse monsters. Its special powers are obviously gigantic size, and you would assume strength. It also has the ability to affect minds and to bestow immortality. Does not have any signature weapons, it just uses its bare hands. It does have a signature technique, however, which involves Christmas treeing its victims. Yes, the Jotun is a very festive creature. So that's your villain profile for The Ritual. All right, let's get to the scorecard for our first movie, The Ritual. Kills. 6. Bare breasts. Well, none. The movie's all dudes, so you don't really expect bare breasts in a movie with all dudes. Car chases, and you would not expect any car chases in a movie that takes place in the woods, and you're correct. There are no car chases in this movie. Possumings, again, no cars, no car chases, no possumings. Christmas treeings, however, there are 3. Now, I say 3, I have the feeling I missed one. I will be honest, I did the vocabulary lesson for this movie after I watched it. I wasn't specifically keeping score for Christmas treeings at the time. I'm working from memory. So the number 3 stands out in my head, but I have this feeling in the pit of my stomach that I might be missing one. Granny punchings. Yes, there is one of those, so you do get a granny punching in this movie. And problematic patellas. There's one of those as well. So Steve's final score for The Ritual, we're gonna give it 2.5 paws out of 4. It's a pretty good creature flick. It's not a great creature flick, but it's pretty good. I would say good production values and a spooky atmosphere offset a generic storyline. So not the greatest movie ever made, but not a waste of your time either. It's pretty good. So that's our scorecard for The Ritual. Our second movie for this episode is She Walks the Woods. There you see the poster right there. This is a found footage creature feature that was released in the year 2019. It was directed by John Crockett and Brian McCulley, and it stars Danny Bonin, Scotty Bonin, Jason Potter, and Vivian Edridge. You've probably never heard of any of those people, but if the Bonin brothers names look familiar, that might be because Danny and Scotty Bonin also host a podcast called The Cult Classic Horror Show. So fans of the Psycho Bunny Death Cult, Psychomantium 13 programming might also be fans of that podcast. Let's talk a little bit about this movie. This is a low-budget, found-footage woodland creature feature. This is not nearly as high a quality found-footage movie as Exists, which we talked about a few weeks ago. It's basically a lot of found footage padding with a few minutes of a Creature Shop's special effects audition reel thrown in at the end. So there are some practical special effects. They had budget for a little bit of practical special effects. They threw them all in at the end of the movie. And so there's obviously a lot of your typical found footage movie padding up front that you have to sift through before you get to that. The gist of the story is that 2 annoying brothers venture into the woods to film an episode of their outdoor survival web series along with their cameraman and his friend. Now, a little more background on that. I don't know if the Bonin brothers are annoying in real life, but the 2 characters they play in this movie are just annoying. Just a couple of guys that have an outdoor web series, and they're just the typical alpha male frat brother bro types who are they're just annoying. Their friend, the cameraman, is bearable, and the girl that goes along with them, played by Vivian Edridge, is an old friend of the cameraman's from film school whose family owns a cabin up in the woods that she thinks would be good for use for the show. She's a fan of the web series, old friend of the cameraman, and wants to help out, and so goes along with them. So the 4 of them head way up into the wilderness to this cabin to film some stuff for an outdoor web series. They then hike in too far and discover why so many people disappear in the national forests every year. At the beginning of this movie, they give you some statistics on the number of people that disappear in the national forests every year. I have no reason to believe that those are accurate, but take them with a grain of salt. Maybe they're correct. I don't know. This movie it's okay. It's subpar acting. It's mediocre practical special effects. The beginning of the movie, with all the padding, the acting's not bad. I mean, it's just people sitting around and ad-libbing, doing your typical found footage padding. The character's a little bit annoying, but I wouldn't say that the acting's bad. They're playing annoying characters, and they're playing them well. Once the terror of the movie truly gets started, then everyone's shortcomings as an actor really comes to the surface. I mean, Vivian Edridge is lovely, but I did not watch this and come away from it thinking, wow, somebody needs to cast her in another movie because she's a great actress. She just was not real compelling. None of them were really compelling. The practical special effects are good, not great. Hats off to them for at least using some practical special effects and not just shaking the camera and not letting you see anything. There are some really chilling sound effects in this movie, and I don't know if it's sound that was recorded specifically for this movie or if they've repurposed sound footage that was found from other sources, but regardless, there's a pretty good usage of sound in this movie. Overall, I would say this is a mediocre found footage film. It's not thrilling. It's not unbearable. It's kind of middle of the road. I would say it's a decent horror movie date movie. It's a really good movie to turn the lights out and turn the sound up and really enjoy the spooky atmosphere of being out at the woods at night and hearing spooky sounds. If you are using this as a date movie and your date is somebody who maybe is not that into horror movies or does not watch them, religiously, you're probably going to have your significant others grab your arm or jump into your lap at some point because the sounds, if nothing else, are pretty spooky in this movie. Let's talk about the villain profile. They never actually identify the villain in this movie. They just refer to her as she in the credits. That's a picture actually from the movie's promotional material. Now, we're going to say it's an unknown class, but there's every reason to believe that this is a Wendigo or something related to a Wendigo, just based upon the appearance of this monster and its actions. Its special powers include, it's just a fearsome, stealthy, nocturnal hunter. It's immensely strong, and it has claws and teeth. It does not use any kind of signature weapon. It just uses its claws and teeth. But it does have a signature technique which involves brunching on its victims in a very celebratory, enthusiastic fashion. So that's your villain profile for She Walks the Woods. Let's get to Steve's scorecard for our second feature for this episode, the movie She Walks the Woods. Kills: 7. Bare breasts: none. You get an almost. Vivian Edridge gets down to her bra and then realizes the camera's still running and makes them turn it off. So, you got an almost. The movie teases you a little bit, but there's none. Car chases: well, yet again, we're up in the woods. You would not expect any car chases, and you're correct. Denoggenings: you've got a partial. It's more of a Pez dispensering than a denoggening, but you've got at least a partial denoggening. Brunchings: oh yes. There are multiple brunchings, one that occurs very clearly and enthusiastically on camera, several that occur off camera, one of which at least you get the sound effects from. Possumings: well, you're not going to have car chases, you're in the middle of the woods, you can't possibly have possumings, right? Well, you've got a pretty long campfire story that involves possumings, so we're going to give it credit for one. Ominously shredded teepees. There is one of those. Now, if it's me and I'm in the woods and I come across an ominously shredded teepee, I'm getting back in the car and heading back to civilization. But not these guys. These guys are committed to their outdoor survival web series, and they should not have been. And finally, dudes who need to stop clinging to the scraps and just shave their heads already. Yeah, there's one of those. I am not sure which of the Bonin brothers it is, but one of them has a shaved head and one of them needs to just get on board and shave his as well, because it's not fooling anybody, dude. So, final score for She Walks the Woods. We're going to give it 2 paws out of 4. I had considered giving it 1.5. I've watched this movie several times now, and it seems like I liked it more when I originally watched it than when I rewatched it. And on the other hand, it does not seem fair to watch a movie multiple times, nitpick it, and then score it. So I'm going to give it 2. I'm going to say it's decent but not great. I would recommend you watch it with the lights out and really enjoy the spooky sounds. Not a bad movie for a horror movie date night. If you've got a fan of a casual fan who you want to have over for a date night and let him or her jump into your lap. So I'm going to give it 2 paws out of 4. Decent but not great. Don't set up your entire evening around it, but you could make it part of a larger evening and have some fun with it. So that's She Walks the Woods. We're almost to the end of this episode, but before we go, it is time to talk about some other stuff Steve watched this week. Number 1, To Your Last Death. In this movie, a woman is given a chance to go back in time to save her siblings from their father's deadly game of revenge. It's kind of a horror sci-fi mashup. The interesting thing about this one is it is 2D animated and very gory. It's a very interesting style of 2D animation. I was really into this movie about 10 to 15 minutes in. Then for me, it faded a bit. It got a little muddled and confusing at the end. Overall, though, I would still say it's a decent to pretty good movie. For me, started out strong and then got muddled at the end, but I won't say don't watch it. I was a little disappointed by how it ended, but overall, I would say it's a good, not great movie. Second movie, Book of Monsters. On the eve of her 18th birthday, a girl discovers her family legacy as a monster hunter with the help of her friends. This is a live-action movie with lots of practical special effects. Now, some of the practical special effects are okay. Some of them, in fact, are pretty good. Some of them are about as convincing as Steve's animatronic stunt double, so it's kind of a mixed bag. There are denogginings aplenty in this movie, and there's just monster action aplenty. It is very much like a more violent, extended, long episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I enjoyed this. I would say it's mediocre to pretty good. Much like To Your Last Death, for me, I started out really into this movie and really interested in it, and then kind of faded a bit, but overall still, I would say it's pretty good and worth watching. So, 2 movies that I would give a more or less a thumbs up to this week. The third thing we're going to talk about is a little different. I watched Invincible Season 1, the Amazon exclusive series. Now, I pre-record these episodes, so you're actually going to hear this episode several weeks after the first season of Invincible wrapped up on Amazon's. But it just, for me, as I'm recording this, it just wrapped up this weekend, so I'm recording this now. Invincible is a little different from what we normally do here. It is a 2D animated superhero cartoon that is done in the style of the Warner Brothers DC cartoons. Now, I am doing this on this show for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I was a huge fan of the various Warner Brothers DC cartoons, the Batman animated series, Batman Beyond, the Zeta Files, the Animated Adventures of Superman, all those series that came along in the 90s and early 2000s. Kevin Conroy, Mark Hamill, they were just terrific. So I was a big fan of that, and I know a lot of people who listen to this show are as well, but also, this is not a cartoon for kids. It is a superhero cartoon, not horror, but it does have some supremely gory bits. There is some stuff in this that is just very, very violent. So it's not really for kids. It is, I think it's rated as like 18 plus. I would say this is out freaking standing. Now, I will tell you, if you watch the first episode, you'll probably make it 3/4 of the way through and think, oh, this is kind of mediocre to pretty good. I don't see what the big deal is. Stick with it to the very end. And I mean stick with it to the very, very end. There is an after-credit scene that goes on for several minutes. And I will tell you, after the last 2 minutes of the episode with the after-credit scene, I was literally left with my jaw hanging open, just staring blankly at the TV. And then after a few seconds, I said, did I just see what I think I just saw? And I had to back it up and watch it again. It is, and at that point, I was just hooked. So I don't want to give away what happens, but stay with it all the way to the end of the very first episode. That's when it gets really good. And from that point on, you'll be hooked because you're going to want to know what happens next. So I really recommend Invincible Season 1. Honestly, I recommend everything I watched this week. To Your Last Death and Book of Monsters. You can do a lot worse. They're not wastes of your time. Again, maybe not the greatest movies ever, but definitely enjoyable. So that's some other stuff Steve watched this week. Well, that wraps it up for another episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. I hope you enjoyed it. We had a good time putting on the show for you. Everybody take care, have a great week, and we'll see you back here again real soon. Bye-bye. Well, that production meeting was even less useful than usual. Steve, you have anything to add? No. How about you, Mr. Fancy? Anything to add? No. All right then. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you again soon on Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. Bye-bye.